Hello and welcome to the fourth and final video in our St Nicholas summer series. This week we have Jarel Robinson-Brown, who's going to talk to us about the history of Christianity in Africa a few hundred years before and a few hundred years after St Nick's was built, to give us a global perspective on our faith. It's great to have you with us.
It's really lovely to be able to do this. One of the things I've always said to people in churches that I've had responsibility for is that they should go and see the church in a place where it is a bit older than where they currently are. So if you're a Christian in Wales, go to St David's Shrine, which will take you to 500 AD. If you're in England, they should go to your favourite cathedral, Jade, up to Durham, and see the Shrine of Cuthbert, which is 1104 AD. And if they're in Scotland, they can go to Iona or Mull. There is, of course, Lindisfarne, there's Rome and Greece, wherever it may be. Just go basically to somewhere where the church is a little bit older than the place where you currently are. Because I think it helps to realize that the Christianity that we experience and encounter in whichever context we're in has a lineage, it has a history, and has been translated to us and transplanted to us from somewhere else. Now, it's easy for us to forget, I think, that Christianity is actually an Eastern religion, that the stories of the Bible are not based in the West, that actually the West became Christian thanks to missionary activity from elsewhere. And one of the places that is often forgotten about when we think about the history of the church is Africa. When we think of Christianity in Africa, I don't know about many of you, but for me, our minds tend to go to the more charismatic, Pentecostal, independent churches. We don't tend to think of Oriental Orthodox Christians, who are some of the oldest Christians in the world and who are living right now in Ethiopia and Egypt. So what I want to do is say something about the history of the church in Africa and link some of the dates that we have related to St. Nick's to the early church in Africa, and to show how some of the traditions still alive at St. Nick's find their origin in early North African Christianity. Now, the earliest date that I have for St. Nick's is 130 AD, 130, which is, I think, the year that the Roman bricks and tiles that the church is partially made out of were created. And then the second earliest date I have is 879 AD, which is the date of the current building. Now, a lot was going on in early North African Christianity, in the early African church between those dates. And the thing that connects St. Nick's to North Africa is, of course, the Roman Empire, because both were part of the empire at one point. And of course, St. Augustine's arrival in England, in Canterbury, in 597 AD, which is the date that we look to for the evangelization of England essentially becoming Christian, that date links us to Rome in a particular way. But 535 years before Augustine arrives in Canterbury, St. Mark is said to have arrived in Alexandria in Egypt. Now, the historian Eusebius, who was the Bishop of Caesarea, tells us that St. Mark, the writer of the earliest and shortest gospel, sees St. Peter martyred in Rome. And he decides to go and get some rest, essentially. St. Mark sees Peter giving up his life for the gospel, and Mark thinks, you know what, I'm going to go and keep my head down somewhere else, and I'm going to write down my version of events in a different place. And he tries to write a version of the gospel, we're told, in a more spiritual direction. And he chooses, for some reason, to go to Alexandria, to the capital of Egypt, for that. Now, legend has it, and the story of the Coptic church, and the story the Coptic church tells itself, that's the Egyptian church, is that St. Mark walks around Alexandria evangelizing sometime around the years 62 to 68 AD. But he does this walking around and evangelizing so much that he wears out the sandals on his feet. And so, needing some repair work done, St. Mark seeks out a cobbler. He hands his sandals over to this cobbler, and the cobbler gets to work. But while he's repairing St. Mark's sandals, this cobbler cuts his hand open, screams out in pain to the one God, and St. Mark asks him rather daringly, "This one God that you've just cried out to, do you even know who or what that God is?" "No," the cobbler says to St. Mark. And St. Mark replies, "Now I know well that God has made my journey here to Alexandria prosperous. In other words, I know why I've come." And St. Mark spits on the ground, creates some clay, something he presumably saw Jesus do in the Gospels, And St. Mark puts that clay on the hand of Anianus, the cobbler, and it immediately heals. Shocked and amazed, as you can imagine, Anianus asks who St. Mark is. And St. Mark simply says to him, a servant of Jesus Christ. And this, we're told, leads Anianus not only to believe in Jesus, but to immediately demand that St. Mark go to his family home and meet his household. And we're told that there and then, Anianus and his whole household were baptized that day, and that his home became the first church in Alexandria. Of course, just because Christianity arrives in a place doesn't mean that all the other religious practices that existed there disappear or cease. The local people of Alexandria, who at that time were still making pagan sacrifices to Roman, Greek, and Egyptian gods, they were not very happy with this influx of Christian converts, nor did they like the fact that St. Mark had a very hard line when it came to pagan sacrifice. So of course they killed him. We are told that St. Mark is essentially rounded up by a vicious Alexandrian mob, and that he was sacrificed to the pagan god Serapis in the year 68 AD. And Serapis is a really ugly looking god. There is a statue of Serapis, if you Google, put his name into Google, which is really quite freaky actually. And this is the god that St. Mark, poor guy, was martyred to or sacrificed to. Now, of course, we don't know, sadly, or at least the historical record doesn't tell us for sure, whether this story of St. Mark going to Alexandria and doing all of this is true. But we do know from the historical record that there is a change around the year 68 AD of more Christians being present in Alexandria. And we don't know why else that might be. So clearly St. Mark went somewhere and did something, and something happens in Alexandria around that year that proves some kind of missionary activity. But just because we don't have clear historical records about that, we do know from scripture that there were Egyptians present, for example, at Pentecost, which is something that we just kind of breeze over. So we know that the early African church was around as early as the life of St. Paul. And we can also imagine that the Ethiopian eunuch who was baptized by Philip went back to Ethiopia, possibly, and maybe spread the gospel at that time. And there are other references to Egypt and Alexandria which suggest an early possible Christian presence there alongside the Jewish community. Now you might be thinking, kind of listening to all that, wondering, why is Africa important? And what does Egypt have to do with Leicester? But all of the founders of Christianity in Britain, Gregory, Augustine, Aidan, David, Bede, Cuthbert, St. Wilfrid, who was the 7th century bishop of Leicester, all of them were monks. They weren't just priests, they were monks. The very first monks, of course, began their life in Africa, in the Egyptian and the Syrian deserts. From the singing of psalms to the making of manuscripts, Egypt was the epicenter of early monastic life. The first monks known to us are St. Paul of Thebes and Anthony the Great, and both of them come from Egypt. And so all those great names that we hold up in Celtic British history and in early British Christian history, they were the recipients, the inhabitants, the direct benefactors, if you like, of a distinctly African tradition. And for reasons that I don't have time to go into now, people like St. Palladius and St. Patrick, the earliest missionaries to Ireland, are distinctly shaped by African monasticism in a different way than the English and the Scottish early monks and nuns. So the Egyptian Christians are important to us. The early Egyptian Christians are important to us because we wouldn't have, for example, the Book of Kells or the intriguing Skellig Michael in Ireland without African monasticism. So those monastic houses at St. Nick's during the Saxon era would have had their life and their ministry, their daily routine shaped by what happened in the early Egyptian desert. And African monasticism was often a place of refuge for queer Christians as well. We know, for example, of Mary of Egypt, who is often talked of as a sexually promiscuous person who torments men and forces sailors to sleep with her. Very fascinating character. and who then escapes into the Egyptian deserts and becomes so emasculated that in many depictions of her, she is visually synonymous with her male counterparts, appearing with no indication of breasts and scars that would be in keeping with a mastectomy. We know too from a palimpsest discovered in St. Catherine's monastery in Egypt that there seems to have existed a saint called Saint Euphrosyne, who was born female but presented as a male monk, entered a monastery and was only discovered to not have female genitalia when she was being prepared for burial by her fellow monks, who were shocked not just because she didn't have the genitals that they thought she might have, but because she was the holiest among them. So holy, in fact, that her father, apparently, when she died, joined the monastery and lived the rest of his days as a monk. So queer folk and themes of intersectionality between religion and race and sexuality, when you look at the Egyptian desert, you see all of this. And there are some really interesting narratives of people who don't fit very clearly either into the clear boxes that we want to put them in terms of gender and sexuality, but also in terms of ethnic identity. So I say that to say that some of St. Nick's commitments to the LGBTQ plus community tie into a lot that was happening in early African Christianity. So let's think particularly about St. Nick's just for a moment. So much of what happens at St. Nick's on a Sunday will owe its origin to the church in Africa. For example, the oldest manuscript of the New Testament in Greek that we have in the world, the Codex Sinaiticus, which is visible at the British Library here in London. That oldest book was found in Egypt, preserved because of the conditions of the climate there and because of the dedication of monks and scholars who preserved these texts for us. The oldest Psalms was found in Africa, in Egypt. It was found under the head of a young girl in her coffin, along with the oldest Syriac version of Matthew's Gospel, also discovered by two women, two scholars from Cambridge, who discovered this palimpsest, which is basically a sheet of paper that's been used, a manuscript that's been used, scraped off and then repurposed, written over. So under the earliest version of Matthew's Gospel, they found this story of Saint Euphrosyne, who I spoke about. The Bible at St. Nick's, read on a Sunday, and when your vicar is preaching or whoever is preaching on a Sunday, when they're quoting from scripture, when we hear those texts in English, the only way we know that that is an accurate translation of the original is because we have an early original. And the only reason we have an early original is because these manuscripts were saved and preserved in Africa for us. It's such an easy thing to take for granted that we just, we have English Bibles and we assume that we have these texts just in English. But of course, the work of scholars wouldn't be possible without the original manuscripts being preserved. So in North Africa in the 3rd century, baptism was done largely by the bishop. Nowadays, we tend to think only of confirmation being done by bishops. And you, in the African context, would be taught lots of things about the faith leading up to your baptism, but in particular, you would be taught the Lord's Prayer. And the bishop would essentially sit down with all these people preparing for baptism and talk to them slowly about the Lord's Prayer, about the themes that come up within it, and about why it is important for Christians. And that prayer that we use and recite so often has a very unique and special place within 3rd century North Africa. And in North Africa, you were taught this as preparation for your baptism, and you were taught it specifically so that you could recite it as an adult as you came up out of the waters of baptism, having just been baptized. And the very first writings that we have on prayer are all dedicated to the Lord's Prayer in particular, and they all come out of 3rd century North Africa. So essentially, there is no writing on prayer in the history of the church until the 3rd century, and the first 3 people to write on the subject of prayer in the history of the Christian church are African theologians. So the first is Tertullian, the second is Origen, and the last is Cyprian. One of them was a bishop, one of them was a priest, and one of them was a layperson. And there's a really lovely thing about that, I think, that actually our earliest thoughts and thinking on prayer come out of North Africa, and the way that we pray is so deeply shaped by some of those texts. In North Africa, it was customary to recite the Lord's Prayer 3 times a day, in the morning, in the afternoon, and the evening, and to do so standing with your arms outstretched. And at times in church, we still see people do this. I served in St. Mary's Primrose Hill for a while, and lots of the people from Easter to Pentecost would say the Lord's Prayer with their hands outstretched while we stood. So much of the life of St. Nick's is shaped by what happened in the early African church. Whoever is being baptized at St. Nick's now, and whoever was being baptized at St. Nick's pre-879 AD, was part of those people who were responding to the gospel through that missionary work by people like Augustine and others. So those people who Pope Gregory sent from Rome to England are those people who evangelize, so that those who are being inspired by the story of Jesus Christ today at St. Nick's, there's a lineage, a direct link, not just to Pope Gregory and to Augustine, but to the early African monks. And it's really interesting because Pope Gregory and the Bishop of Alexandria at the time, Pope Eulogius, or Bishop Eulogius, was a close friend of Pope Gregory. And it's really interesting because Pope Gregory thanks in a letter Bishop Eulogius, the Bishop of Alexandria, so the bishop in Egypt, for his prayers for the success of the missionary work that takes place in Britain. And only recently I discovered a letter from Pope Gregory to Bishop Eulogius apologizing for some of the wood that he was sending, some of the timber he was sending to Egypt, because it was smaller than what the Bishop of Alexandria had requested, because the ship that Pope Gregory managed to use was so small. So this idea that we have in our minds of the East and West being completely split, and this idea that we have of Africa being, the African church being a completely different kind of church to the church that we are part of, didn't really exist in the minds of some of the earliest theologians and scholars and missionaries to Britain. So there were real, friendly, genuine relationships between the church in Africa and the church elsewhere. So I say that really as a kind of short introduction to some of the history in early African Christianity and the life that is still existing today at St. Nick's. That actually Leicester and Africa are not that far apart, that there is a lot that is still happening at St. Nick's that owes its origin to the early African church. And so it's worthwhile just thinking about what bits of Christian history do we focus on and what bits do we ignore? And why is it that we hear so little about early African Christianity when actually we genuinely owe to it so much? Even things like holy, holy, holy that we say at the Eucharist on a Sunday, we say that because the early Egyptian Christians thought that it was important that we use the same language of the angels to worship God. So there are so many things which link us to the early church in Africa. And I just wanted to share that with you as a taster. So thank you for your time. And it's been great to be with you.
That was incredible. Thank you so much, Jarel, for coming, to this church. We hope you've liked this video and all of the ones in our summer series. It's our first ever one, so feedback is really appreciated. As I've said in previous videos and sort of all of the time, if you want to donate to support the work of St. Nicholas, there's a link in the description of the video, and we'll put the website at the end of the video and just everywhere. If you're ever in Leicester, you are more than welcome to come and visit us and worship with us. We'd be really happy to see you. Thank you so much, and goodbye.